Bonjour! Thank you for joining me today for Princess Storytime. Today I'll be reading from this very old fairy tales book which is 70 years old. Some of your grandparents might have had these same stories read to them when they were your age. Today's story is Hansel and Gretel, as retold by Katherine Gibson. Once upon a time there was a poor woodcutter whose wife had died. As he had 2 small children, he had to get a woman from the village to come and care for them. When he was about, the woman was quite kind, because she hoped to marry the woodcutter. But when he was away at his work, the 2 children, Hansel and Gretel, did not fare so well. Times grew harder and harder until finally no one had any money to pay a woodcutter. Each man had to do for himself as best he could. The woodcutter could not sell so much as a twig. One morning when the children were out playing, and the woman thought they could not hear, she said to the woodcutter, "We have almost no food in the house. Tomorrow let us go out to the forest as if to cut wood. We shall build a fire to keep the children warm and give them each a big slice of bread. And when night falls, we shall come home and leave them there." The man was quite unwilling to fall in with the plan. "Then," said his housekeeper, "we shall all starve." Now Hansel, who was listening by the door, heard every word. And that night, when the moon shone brightly, he crept out of bed and gathered his pockets full of the whitest pebbles he could find. The next day, they all went to the forest. When the shadows fell and it began to grow cool, the woodcutter built a warm fire. The woman gave the children some bread, and she and their father went off among the trees. The children thought they could hear the sound of the axe, but it was really only 2 branches rubbing together in the wind. When it was quite dark, Gretel began to cry. "Have no fear," said Hansel. "As I walked along, I scattered little white pebbles every step I took, and when the moon is high, we shall be able to see them plainly and find our way home." And so it was. By following the pebbles shining white in the silvery light, they made their way safely back to their father's cottage. When they knocked at the door, the woodcutter welcomed them with all his heart, but the woman was angry. However, she pretended not to be at all surprised and only said, "You are both careless children to have stayed in the woods so long. How we worried for fear that wolves had devoured you." Times grew even worse, and the day came when there was but half a loaf in the house and no meal to make more. The woman said to the woodcutter, "We must take the children to the woods and leave them, for if we do not, we shall all die of hunger." The man was most unwilling to do so, but he said, "Perhaps some passing huntsman may take them in and feed them. That is more than I can do." Now Hansel, who was standing near the door, heard every word. When the moon was high, he crept out of bed, only to find that the woman had locked the door and taken the key. "Do not cry, Gretel," he said. "Surely help will come to us." And they both lay down to sleep. The next day they all went to the forest. When the shadows fell, a fire was built and the children were given the last crust of bread. They thought they could hear the sound of the axe, but it was really only 2 branches of a tree rubbing together in the wind. When it was quite dark, Gretel began to cry. "Have no fear," said Hansel. "As we walked along, I scattered little bits of bread every step I took. When the moon is high, we shall be able to see the bread plainly and find our way home." But when they started to look, not a crumb could they find, for the birds had eaten every one. Gretel wept bitterly, but Hansel comforted her. Together they lay near the fire and went to sleep under a pile of leaves. The next morning they wandered through the woods, taking first this path and then that. Finally they came to a clearing where the sun shone warmly. In the very center of it all was a tiny house with a peaked roof like an elf's hat. As the children drew near, they found the house was made of gingerbread, with a roof of round cookies and windows of clear sugar candy. Quickly they began to eat, now a bit from a corner, there a bite of the eaves. And then they heard a voice saying, "Nibble, nibble, mousekin, who's nibbling at my housekin?" And the children answered, "Wind touches your house as it goes by, but its hungry hands you cannot spy." Again the voice called out, "Nibble, nibble, mousekin, who's nibbling at my housekin?" And the children sang again, "Wind touches your house as it goes by, but its hungry hands you cannot spy." Out of the house came an old woman hobbling on a stick. She was dressed all in black with a high-crowned hat. Behind her walked a large black cat. "And what do you mean?" she cried angrily, "eating at my house?" "Oh, please do forgive us," said Gretel. "We did not know that anyone lived here. We are two lost children who mean no harm." The old woman lifted Gretel's chin to see if she were plump or not. "Yes, I can see that you are well brought up. Come in, my dears." Hansel and Gretel entered the little house. They were given a fine supper on painted dishes and soon fell asleep on sweetly scented beds. The next morning they dined on strawberries and cream and the finest bread, and until evening they danced and played in the sun. The second day was very different. The first thing the old woman did was to fasten Hansel to a large goose pen, there to fatten him up until he should be just right to eat. For she was, in truth, a wicked witch. Poor Gretel had to do the roughest work, scrubbing and carrying heavy pails of water. When she had a chance, she leaned over Hansel's pen, and from under her apron she handed him a chicken bone. When the old witch comes to feel how fat you are, stick this bone out between the boards of your pen. She is nearly blind and will think it is your finger. As you seem to grow no fatter, she will not want to eat you so soon. Hansel did as Gretel said. Every time the witch came to see how fat he had grown, he held out the chicken bone. The old witch stamped and scolded, and because she was so angry, she switched Gretel about the ankles to make her hurry, though the poor child never stopped to take a second breath all day. At last the old witch made up her mind to eat Hansel thin as he was. She built a great fire in the oven. When it was hot, she called to Gretel, "Go see that all is ready." Now Gretel guessed the old witch's plan. She knew she herself would be pushed into the big oven, so she pretended to not be able to open it. "There, you clumsy girl," said the old witch, pulling the door open. But before she had a chance to utter another word, Gretel shoved her into the oven and slammed the door. Then she ran quickly and let Hansel out of the goose pen. They skipped with joy, and running into the house, they found the witch's gold hidden away in an old blue pot. It was almost more than they could carry. As they were leaving, a most delicious fragrance came from the oven. Opening the door, they found the witch, changed into gingerbread and done to a turn. Eagerly, Hansel bit off her gingerbread nose, while Gretel ate the crown off her hat. They walked for a long time through the woods and came at last to a large blue lake. "How shall we ever get across?" asked Hansel. Just then they saw a large white duck swimming toward them. Gretel called, "O duck who always says quack, quack, ride us across on your downy back." So the duck carried them to the other side of the lake. They thanked her politely and gave her a gold piece to tuck under each wing. "You may need these when you are old," they said. The two children did not have to travel long before they reached their very own door. The woodcutter could not tell of his joy at seeing them again. He had long since sent the housekeeper away. What became of her, no one will ever know. With the help of the witch's gold, the three of them, Hansel, Gretel, and the woodcutter, lived happily in their little house all the rest of their days. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you again soon. Au revoir.